Welcome everybody to the Homeschool Plus conference. I'd like to introduce Bernard Bull. Bernard is a father of 2 homeschooled children, Assistant Vice President of Academics and Associate Professor of Education at Concordia University Wisconsin. His recent work and research focus upon self-directed learning, the intersection of education and digital culture, blended and online learning, and alternative credentialing systems. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Homeschool Life, G3, Homeschool Education Magazine, and Blackboard Collaborate for making this conference possible. Now, if everybody would like to let us know where they're from, to the left of the whiteboard, there are tools. The second one down is a star or a sun. If you'd like to click on that and put it where you are from in the world. Also write down in the chat box. Oh, hi Piyush, welcome. Hi Bill. Hi Tim. So if everybody would like to let us know where they're from. Okay, I can only see 4 markers. Okay, it's over to you, Bernard.
Very good. Well, thanks for joining me, everyone. I'm excited to spend a little time with you today to explore this, the way that some of the emerging trends in education are impacting homeschooling. So you may have seen in the title, I took off the initial part of the title for this presentation, but I initially called it Beyond the Dining Room Table, 10 Trends that are Transforming Homeschooling in the Digital Age. And that first part of the title, Beyond the Dining Room Table, as many of you may know, attaches to sort of a stereotype in homeschooling. Many people have this image that the homeschooler is the one who sits at the dining room table and fills out these worksheets and workbooks throughout the day, and that's pretty much the extent of their schooling experience. And yet most of us who are involved with homeschooling and alternative education, we know that it's much more than that, and there's much more going on. So some of the things that we'll be exploring here will be no surprise. Others may be a bit of a surprise. My work revolves around, as was mentioned, the intersection of digital culture and education. It doesn't mean that I'm always interested in just looking at how technology is impacting education. I'm more interested in digital culture as a whole. So for example, in the digital world, we have a more connected world. And as we're more connected, we're able to do things more easily than we were before. We're able to connect with people around the world. I often mention that my world was sort of transformed when I was reading a book by a scholar at Harvard University, my first year out of college. And as I was reading the book, I had a question that I wanted to ask the author. And I realized that I could ask the author. So I found the author's email address online, Howard Gardner, and I emailed him, and I got a reply back within a day from, I think it might have been his graduate assistant. And I actually responded back and forth several times in this email, and it was a really rich experience. But in that instant, the experience of reading a book was turned into a two-way conversation. That's an example of how the digital world or digital culture is impacting our learning experiences in education. So I would say that that's not just about technology, that's about connectivity, about community, about connection, about collaboration. And that's what we're going to look at here. We're going to look at some of the trends in the digital world that are having some significant impacts on education as a whole, but also homeschooling contexts and alternative education contexts. So let's go ahead and get started. So this first image, again, is that sort of stereotypical image of maybe what homeschooling looks like for people. There might be a student at a dining room table or at a desk, and this is where the majority of their work takes place. And if we look at definitions for homeschooling, here are three that are pretty familiar, or pretty commonplace. The first one from Webster Dictionary: to teach your children at home instead of sending them to school. So one way that people often define homeschooling is just that contrast between the home and a school building. A second would be the education of children at home by their parents. So this one too really places homeschooling in the home, and it replaces the role of teacher in a school to the parent as teacher. And we have a third definition: the education of children at home, typically by parents or by tutors, rather than in other formal settings of public or private school, from Wikipedia. So all of these have some things in common. They place home as the primary context of schooling, and they tend to emphasize parents as the teachers. So in essence, these three definitions of homeschooling are really taking the idea of schooling, and they're just moving it to a different place, and they're giving the title teacher to a different person. But I'd like to suggest that that there's a broader definition we can consider for homeschooling that can help us quite a bit, and that can help us recognize some of these trends and these transformations that are happening. So the definition that I'm really favorable to is this one from Family Education that says homeschooling is learning outside of the public or private school environment. Now, the one downside is this is really defining homeschooling by what it's not. But there are two things I'd like to point out in this. First of all, you'll notice that in the past three definitions, the emphasis was really upon teaching. It was upon what the teacher does to a learner. And yet in this definition, the emphasis is upon learning, regardless of who the teacher is or isn't, or even if there is a teacher. So this definition embraces more traditional, like a classical homeschooling environment, but it also embraces something like unschooling and more sort of student and self-directed schooling. It's a much more inclusive definition. The other part that I'd like to point out about this definition is that it doesn't state where homeschooling happens. I know in the title, or in the phrase, homeschooling, we assume then that since it's schooling and has the word schooling in home, that it's schooling at home. But really what we find today, and many of you involved with homeschooling probably already know, is that homeschooling happens in far more places than just the home. In fact, my children are homeschooled, but on any given day, they may only spend an hour or two at home. They may be spending a lot of their other learning experiences are happening all over the place, all over the community, and online. So, the two things, again, that I really like about this definition that will help us in this next hour are, one, the focus is upon learning, not just who's doing the teaching. And second, it's not limiting homeschooling to just what happens in a home, in a physical home. Again, I didn't mention this before, but feel free to interrupt with comments or questions or anything like that. I may not notice them, but I'll try to keep an eye on them, and I'll try to respond to them as they come. Also, we'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. Okay, so another thing that I think is important, and the reason I really like this definition, is that there are as many different approaches to and philosophies of homeschooling as there are public or private schooling. One of the things that seems to happen oftentimes when we start getting into these conversations about education is we use a term, and then certain people have this one set view of what that term means, like homeschooling or schooling in and of itself. When in reality, I visit lots of schools. I visit 20, 30, 40 or more schools a year. And when I do so, the one thing that's I'm consistently reminded of is how different schools are. I intentionally try to visit diverse school environments. I visit Montessori schools and project-based learning schools and self-directed learning schools and things like that. But the reality is there are just lots of different philosophies out there, and they shape the way that school looks and feels. The same thing is true for homeschooling. So we have as I mentioned before, we have everything from a classical schooling vision to unschooling to everything in between in terms of philosophies and visions. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some of these trends that are really starting to take shape and starting to influence homeschooling and other forms of schooling as well. The first one is actually two, but I'm putting it together for time's sake, which is blended and online learning. So online learning is simply learning that's facilitated through an online learning environment. Many of you are probably familiar with the idea of online courses, And we'll talk about just a couple of them that are especially significant right now in the homeschooling and alternative education environment. But then the other term I'd like to share is blended learning. Now, I share this image quite often when I present, but it's a picture of a remote control, and let me explain what this has to do with blended and online learning. Let's imagine for a moment that you're sitting in a traditional classroom environment, and you're sitting in desks and rows, and there's a teacher up front, and you're listening, and you get a little bit bored. And in your moment of boredom, you look down and you notice a remote control on the ground. So you reach down and you grab the remote, and in a moment of playfulness, you point it at the teacher and press pause, and lo and behold, the teacher pauses. You realize you have something sort of fun in your hands, so you fast forward and rewind. You try maybe the picture-in-picture so you can see something happening in a different classroom at the same time. And you realize that you have all of these affordances, all of these features and abilities to the classroom that you never had before. Well, the part that's exciting and sort of interesting is that this is a reality today in education. With new learning environments and contexts, things like online learning and blended learning, we do actually have the ability to give the learner a learning remote control, the ability to rewind, to fast forward, to record, to pause, to control the learning environment with features like that. So picture, for example, even something as simple as YouTube, where we have recorded content that learners might use. People say, well, maybe that's not much more different than a lecture face-to-face. But it does have different affordances and different limitations. It has the limitation in that you can't easily just sort of raise your hand or shout out a question to the teacher. But it has the affordances that you can actually pause it, fast forward it, rewind it. And this is really key because one of the limitations of traditional schooling environments has often been that they don't know how to customize by time. If one learner needs more time and another learner needs less time, it's really hard for a single teacher with a class of 30 to adjust and to adapt. And many people have actually chosen homeschooling because they want to have that more customized, personalized, individualized capability for learners to be able to go at a faster or a slower pace. And leveraging these online tools and technologies, we're finding that that's more and more possible today. So blended learning is sometimes simply defined as the combination of online learning experiences with face-to-face learning experiences. And in the middle there, we have that blended. So I often define blended learning as the best of face-to-face and the best of online combined. In the early days of online courses and online learning, it was really little more than sort of a duplication of face-to-face. They created recorded lectures and the students watched them and they wrote papers and took tests, and they tried to make it look sort of like a traditional class. But as people got more comfortable with online environments, they realized there were all sorts of creative and varied ways of teaching and learning in an online environment that were impossible in a face-to-face environment. Those are the unique affordances of online learning. The same thing, face-to-face has some affordances, the ability to spontaneously make a comment or ask a question. And so what happens when you blend those two, when you mix those up? And that's what we're starting to see now. More homeschoolers are beginning to embrace this. They're sometimes self-blending. They have their face-to-face experiences, learning in their home or wherever, but they're also blending that with supplements and resources that they find, or maybe that parents or other facilitators find for them, or a combination. And they're creating these self-blended learning experiences. In fact, I just published, there's a new book that will be coming out here soon on what's called Hudagogy, self-determined learning. And I just wrote a chapter in that on what's called Adventures in Self-Blended Learning, where students are taking the responsibility, where learners are taking the responsibility to blend their own experiences, to figure out what they need to be successful, and then they blend both face-to-face and online experiences to get what they need to accomplish their goals. 3 examples of sort of the online and blended happening that are increasingly common. I'll start at the bottom and work my way up. One is Google Helpouts. So you've probably heard of Google Hangouts, which is a tool through Google where you can meet a series of people and you can have a video chat with people from around the world, and you can have multiple people talking, and you can share a PowerPoint. It has some neat features in it. Well, Google Helpouts is leveraging the technology of Google Hangouts, but it's a new tool by Google where mentors and experts can share that they're willing to be available for 10, 15, or 30-minute sessions with anyone for free or for a fee, and you can go and look through the experts and find out someone who has an expertise that you want or need, and you can make an appointment to meet them in essentially a Google Hangout. And some of these are free, some of them are available. Well, this kind of a technology is really exciting and interesting from the homeschooling perspective. Now we have hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands potentially of tutors and mentors and experts that can be accessed through organized environments like this when students are working on something. So you might be able to find an ecologist when you're working on a particular unit about ecology or geography or world history, or if you're studying a different part of the world, you can connect with someone who's willing to be available to be an expert and talk about a particular part of the world. So Google Helphouse is just one example of dozens that are emerging. The virtual homeschool group, I learned about this at last year's Homeschool Plus conference. I think the person who created it and leads it was one of the presenters. And this is actually an online, almost like an online school for homeschoolers. It's like a co-op online where different parents facilitate online courses, and I believe it's free. And it's targeting high school students. And you can sign up to teach a course, or a student can sign up to take a course through this virtual homeschool group. So that's a really interesting and exciting development. And then we have MOOCs, which have gotten a lot of attention over the last several years, massive open online courses. But what's so interesting is seeing how learners are using them. So a student might be a homeschooler, or even a student in a traditional school might be studying English or writing, and they want some more feedback on their writing. And so they sign up for a massive open online course from some university that's free. It's open to anyone. There's thousands of people sometimes. And they can submit their writing, and they get feedback from peers and from others in that course, or they might gain some information. So they're almost using these MOOCs, these massive open online courses, like textbooks or resources to accomplish their learning goals. So blended and online learning is clearly a trend that's pretty significant. A second one is project-based learning. So a simple definition here from the Buck Institute is a teaching method where students gain knowledge and skills by working for an extended period of time to investigate and respond to a complex question, problem, or challenge. So in many learning environments, in many traditional schools, most of schooling is survey knowledge. And in fact, the way that they even break up the school day is often broken up into 40-minute segments, or maybe they do what's called block scheduling, and it's a 2-hour section for one course or one class. But they usually spend 45 minutes or 50 minutes or an hour on one subject, and then they switch to the next subject, and they switch to the next subject, which is really interesting because as many people are critiquing the digital age, talking about how young people they can't pay as much attention for an extended period of time because they keep switching from website to device to app to different things like that. But our schooling system for years, since the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, has done the same thing. We have taught people's brains to kind of shift from subject to subject every 45 minutes. And that does a fine job in giving people survey knowledge and giving them an overview of a topic. But if we want learners to experience learning in depth, to experience depth over breadth, a really deep understanding of a skill or a certain body of knowledge, then that requires learners having an extended period of time, the opportunity to get lost and lose track of time as they're working and investigating, working on a problem or investigating a question or a challenge. And that's really the spirit of project-based learning. If you're interested in looking at this from a homeschooling perspective, I've really enjoyed the writings from projectbasedhomeschooling.com. It's a website listed at the bottom of this slide. And that's there's a book of the same title, Project-Based Homeschooling, that has ideas for parents that are interested in homeschooling. This is obviously a model that's being used in brick and mortar, traditional face-to-face schools as well. It's being used in homeschooling. More and more people are beginning to recognize that it's not just about learning in depth, but as you go in depth and you sort of get the chance to work on something over an extended period of time, it's a really authentic learning experience, but it also allows you to develop skills that you can't learn from surface level learning experiences. When you go deep into something, you discover what it takes to become an expert at something. You discover the amount of time it takes. You experience kind of the joy of working really hard for an extended period of time and then having this aha moment. And that's the kind of sort of character trait and a kind of learning skill that allows one to become a true lifelong learner and to be able to learn something new whenever they want throughout the rest of their lives. So project-based learning is a trend that's getting embraced in many ways. The Buck Institute that I mentioned here is one of the larger proponents of it, BIE.org. You can check that out and find more resources on it. But this is a really promising movement that we're seeing. Third one, and this one is probably people are less familiar with it. You may be familiar with the concept of digital badges, but let me just explain a little bit more. So digital badges for learning. Let me share an example, and then I'll define digital badges. In 2013, the mayor of Chicago, Illinois, wanted to do something for summer programming. As students left their schools for the summer, and they weren't focused on learning as much, he wanted to figure out, well, how can we provide summer learning experiences for young people that want it and families that want it? And he went through a variety of possibilities, but eventually what they realized is they already had a really rich network of summer learning experiences in the city of Chicago. They had museums, parks, different camps that were being offered. There were tons of private, nonprofit, different kinds of organizations and individuals who were offering tons of learning experiences throughout the city. And so what his vision was, and what his team's vision was what if we actually gathered all those people together and we just encouraged them to continue doing the same thing they've always done in the past, but what if we networked them? What if we connected them all through a credentialing system called digital badges, where the students, when they demonstrated learning from these various experiences throughout the city, they could earn these digital badges that were actually tied to standards in Chicago public schools around science, technology, engineering, and math, so STEM education. And so as students went through these summer experiences, they collected these digital badges that were a recognition of what they'd learned. Now, you could think of this in terms of like Boy Scouts, where Boy Scouts earned badges in the past, but this is different. This is different because these are digital, and you actually own the badge, and you can put it online in what's called a digital backpack. You own that credential, and you can share that on a resume or a portfolio. It is evidence of your learning, and built into every badge, burned into it, is what's called metadata. And usually the metadata includes who issued the badge, when was it issued, what criteria had to be met in order to earn the badge. So it's what we call a micro-credential, and it gives really rich, detailed insight into exactly what a person had to do in order to earn that badge. So it becomes richer and even more significant than even like a traditional high school transcript. And many people in homeschooling they struggle with that a little bit. Well, if I don't have a traditional transcript, what do I do when my student is applying to college? And there are many, books and resources out there that address that issue and give lots of ways of addressing it. I am convinced that the digital badging movement is going to transform that, because what it does is it democratizes credentials. Instead of a school owning a transcript, what if every time you learn something, regardless of where you learned it or how you learned it, you could get this badge? And that badge had the criteria that you had to meet to earn the badge attached to it. And now you could have this collection of badges over a 12-year learning experience. And then when you're applying to a school or you want to show people what you've learned, you simply share with them the website to your collection of badges. And there's good security behind it, and there are new developments coming behind this badge movement all the time. I am convinced that this is going to transform the way we think about homeschooling in the future as well. In fact, I'm currently working on a project that I'm not quite ready to launch, but I'll share it with you guys, where I'm hoping to build essentially a credentialing system through digital badges that homeschool families could leverage if they want to find some kind of way of providing an ongoing, really rich transcript. There are companies and organizations out there that do transcripting for homeschoolers, and parents often do that on their own. But this would be an alternate option that I think has some real promise and possibility. Now, there are some links at the bottom here, and I think there will be a way for you to download this if you wish at the end, and you'll be able to click on these links. The other option is I have a blog called etale, etale.org, and if you just typed etale in Google, and then after it typed digital badges for learning, you'll find about 15 or 20 articles that I've written on the subject, and these are just links to a few of them. One is called Want to Issue Open Badges. Here are some options. And that's an article that gives you a list of about 12 to 14 ways that you can start issuing digital badges to people. So a parent or a homeschool group or whatever could use one of these resources and start issuing digital badges. Another one is called Democratizing Academic Credentials with Open Badges, and that's where I share a little bit more where I see the power of digital badges over traditional credentials. And then how will badges and micro-credentials challenge formal education? So those are three of probably a dozen or more articles that I've written on the subject. But if this interests you, piques your interest, please feel free to check some of those out. Okay, the next trend that we're going to talk about then is place-based education. And some of you may be familiar with this already, but here's a simple definition. Place-based education, or PBE, immerses students in local heritage, cultures, landscapes, opportunities, and experiences, using these as a foundation for the study of language arts, math, social studies, science, and other subjects around the curriculum. So place-based education is very much sort of the opposite of what we talked about at the beginning. While some people have this image of homeschooling as a student sitting at a dining room table working on workbooks, the reality is there are more and more opportunities and resources in many of our communities that we can leverage in order to provide a much richer sort of place-based experience, where learners are going, they're going to the forest for science class or to the park. They are spending time in different workplaces to do job shadowing and maybe to help out. They're doing volunteer work. They're using math to solve local community problems and issues. They're finding issues that are out there in the real world, and they're stepping outside their homes, and they're engaging with lots of people. One of the things that's really exciting to see how place-based education is transforming as homeschooling is people have had these stereotypes, for example, which have never really been valid, but stereotypes of homeschooling where there seems to be less communication skill being developed by the young people. Most of us involved with homeschooling know that that's not a reality, that homeschoolers oftentimes tend to be far more developed in communicating with people across different ages and different groups, because that's sort of the nature. They're not just communicating with people of the same grade level and the like. But here in place-based education, it takes it to a whole nother level, where there's this really intentional effort in many homeschool families for their young people to connect and engage with the world around them, with the community around them. In fact, this would tie in also with world schooling, where there are some parents who take their kids and they're on the road and they're traveling the world and they're learning and experiencing at the same time. So place-based education is a movement that's becoming more and more possible because we're seeing more resources available to easily do this. We can connect with people in our community and beyond much more easily using digital tools, and that can turn into face-to-face conversations. I, for example, get contacted by homeschoolers probably 15 to 20 times a year where they want to connect with me and interview me about some kind of topic or theme that they're working on. They're doing some kind of project-based learning experience. And sometimes I might meet people at a coffee shop or something, and we'll sit and we'll talk. Or they'll tell me about the ways that they're visiting different companies and organizations, the way that they're engaging with the community through volunteer work, and that's really a immersive part of their learning experience. Then we have adaptive learning software. Now this one goes a very different direction than some of the others, but I'm convinced that it's going to continue to develop for better or for worse, and we'll see it used more and more in homeschooling and in traditional schooling environment. Adaptive learning software is software that has sort of this algorithmic technology built behind it that allows the software to literally adapt to how the learner is performing. So if a learner is doing really well with a series of problems or questions, it provides more complex problems, and it documents what they have mastered and what they haven't. And they progress, and it takes them to increasingly more complex ideas and issues as they go through. And if they need more review, then it can adjust, and it will recognize that and take them through. It tracks all of this data, tons of data points about the learner, and in the process it's giving them feedback and it helps them learn. Two areas where we're seeing this develop the most are in mathematics and in language acquisition. So even little apps like your iPhone, one called Duolingo, you may have heard of, and there are others. Certainly Rosetta Stone is being talked about. It is a piece of software that people use. But some of these language packages are getting more advanced as they develop this adaptive learning capability, so it's really adjusting to each individual learner. So it's not as if every learner is getting the same thing. Each learner gets their own customized, personalized experience. Dreambox and Alex Math are two really popular ones, and Carnegie Learning, another one, all dealing with math instruction. And this is certainly a development. Some of you may be using this with young people in your home already, but we're going to see this develop more and more, and it's going to go far beyond math and language instruction. We're seeing more free apps, even if you just do a search. At the bottom I have here edsurge.com/adaptive-learning. EdSurge is a wonderful news source for educational developments and innovations and entrepreneurial efforts. And this particular website gives you a list of adaptive learning software and resources that are currently on the market for free or for a fee. And so that gives a sense of what's happening in math. And language instruction and some developing areas. So then we have a sixth one, which is the do-it-yourself movement. And the next couple of slides are actually going to be connected to one another. A few books on the side actually relate to, in fact, Blake Bowles, I believe, is speaking at in about 30 minutes for this conference, College Without High School. That's one of many books he's written that seems to be part of this do-it-yourself learning movement. We have Hacking Your Education, or Uncollege, that's up at the top, and DIY-U. So 3 popular books. And then if you go to DIY.org, this is actually a do-it-yourself website. And what do-it-yourself learning is learning by doing, right? It sticks. It helps you become a more self-directed and self-governed learner when you learn by doing. And the do-it-yourself movement is, some people tie it to the unschooling movement, but you don't have to necessarily buy into full unschooling philosophy to buy into the value of do-it-yourself learning. It's this idea that when it's hands-on, it's immersive, and we're doing something with it, kind of like project-based learning, it's going to stick more. It becomes more self-directed. So it's not just about what you're learning, it's about the fact that you're learning how to learn. You're developing the confidence and competence to be that lifelong learner. DIY.org is an interesting example where lots of homeschooling families and others are using this website. You can create an account for a young person, and they create videos as there are challenges for them, sort of do-it-yourself challenges, and they can create videos to demonstrate that they have accomplished a challenge or that they have learned something. And it's better just experience than just my describing it. So if you take a few minutes and go to DIY.org, check out the website, kind of get a feel for it. You might have to create a free account and look around. You'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. But this is a really significant movement, and it's tied to some other things I'm going to talk about right at the very end of my presentation. The do-it-yourself learning movement. This is something that people have talked about for a long time. We could go back to Illich and Paulo Freire and others in the 70s, and other times, if we go to the 60s and 70s, we see a lot of authors and people who are writing about more self-directed learning environments. What's changed? So why is it that now this is really taking off, where it was written about a lot and there were some experiments, but now it seems to have really blossomed and more people, it's becoming more mainstream. Why is that? I happen to believe that one of the reasons, there are many others, but one of the reasons has to do with the fact that we have the technologies and resources that make this more available to people. It's becoming more transparent as we learn the power and possibility of different digital tools and technologies for do-it-yourself learning and connected learning. And I'm happy to talk about that more one-on-one with people if they want to email me or talk to me at the end. The next one then is makerspaces. So makerspaces certainly fits with the do-it-yourself movement, but this is about a physical space. In fact, Jackie, I think, is giving a presentation at the same time I am right now, and she's talking very specifically about the concept of makerspaces. And a makerspace is simply a space that's set aside, oftentimes with a series of resources, and it's sort of a community, and people go there to make things. Sometimes they're devoted to electronics. It could be related to carpentry and other kinds of creative crafting kinds of things. The book here on the left represents sort of one vision for makerspaces in education called Invent to Learn. And there are many things. If you browse on the web, you'll find a lot about this. The maker fairs going on around the country. But this is really, or not just around the country, around the world. I'm presenting here from the United States. But makerspaces are these open spaces that are really learner-directed or person-directed, maker-directed, where they want to create something. And they can go there, they can find some mentoring and coaching from other people informally. They find the resources that they need to build and to create the tools that they need to build and create Some of these have a small fee or membership fee. Some of them are open or free or funded in other ways. But we have this really rich movement of makerspaces, and many of you, if you live near larger cities, there's very likely a makerspace nearby. I live near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and this image here is one of the makerspaces right here in Milwaukee. I'm sure that many of you could find some near you, although they're not everywhere quite yet. In fact, some traditional schools are building makerspaces within their schools, and they're realizing the real power and possibility of giving learners these chances to get lost in a project and to build something with their own hands, to be involved in sort of the design process and the prototyping and things like that. So makerspaces growing very quickly. Another trend, we're seeing more homeschool families starting to embrace this and giving their young people an opportunity to go to and participate in these makerspaces. And then this is one that I presented on last year at the Homeschooling Plus conference, which is the concept of a student personal learning network. So in education, if any of you are in the field of education or you talk to teachers, a real hot topic in the last 5 to 10 years has been this idea of a personal learning network. It's the idea that you learn by connecting with different people and communities and resources. And as a learner, you build your own network of resources. Maybe the library and all the books in the library is a node on your network. Certain people are your go-to people for certain subjects, and you call them, almost sort of the phone-a-friend resource when you're working on something. There are people that you email and you connect with online. Maybe you have something like a Twitter account, or you use other social media like Facebook or other groups, and you reach out to those people for resources. There may be certain people or tools that you use like YouTube to figure out how to do something or how to problem solve, certain favorite websites online or blogs that you follow. All of those collectively add up to what we call a personal learning network. And in education, there was a big move of teaching teachers how to build their own personal learning network. But what was so interesting and largely absent from the early conversations of a personal learning network is the reality that this is what we want our learners to be developing. That this isn't just something for a teacher to develop for professional development of their own, but imagine the possibility of a 12-year learning experience where young people are collectively or individually building their own personal learning networks. They're sort of mapping out, who do I go to for what are the resources, and they're learning to kind of manage these different connections with different people, and they use them to learn and accomplish goals. When they have questions, they learn how to use them. They learn to be more intentional and sort of systematic about what kind of resource to use for what kind of question or problem. They learn to develop kind of information literacy, so they know how to sort of evaluate the validity of different claims and different resources. And so this kind of a student personal learning network is really made possible with the connected world and with digital tools and technologies. And people are able to reach out. As I mentioned in the opening, like when I read this book right out of college and I emailed the author for the first time, I emailed an author, that person became part of my personal learning network. Not just the book, but the author was part of my network. Since then, I have reached out to hundreds of authors and founders of companies. I have no one who says no to me whenever I ask if they'd be willing to chat or answer a few questions by email. Maybe they're busy and they say later, but I don't get people who are typically rude. We have a connected world that's increasingly open to the possibility of interacting with and assisting one another. And so this is a very different concept of learning, of just building this network. And this is a trend that's growing quickly, and we're seeing more people embrace it. And I'm a big proponent of being intentional about nurturing this in young people and in learners, helping them to think about intentionally crafting their own student personal learning networks or lifelong personal learning networks. And then we have another trend in education that I think is very significant. If you look at the bottom and you look on the left-hand side, if you were to go to a restaurant and order a meal, it might look like this. This one has French fries, and I see some cucumbers and some kind of meat on the side there. I'm not sure what else is there. But in other words, you order from a menu, you have a series of choices, but then they deliver to you a plate of items. Maybe you can ask one thing to be withheld or substituted, but generally it's a pre-made meal for you. And that's historically how we've thought about much of education. In traditional schooling, you go to a particular school, and that essentially means that you sign up for the menu of options available at that school. It's sort of a pre-served meal of education. The teacher decides what goes on the plate largely and what
sort of how much you get on your plate and when you get it. A lot of that stuff is more teacher or school directed. In homeschooling, some homeschooling environments still have the parent making a lot of those decisions, or some kind of teacher making the decisions. But we're also recognizing now that we live in an age of unbundled education. So if you look at the 4 circles at the top, your learning experiences may not come from one person, not from one sole teacher or from one book or one curriculum. You may have learning experiences by going out in the community, as I mentioned before, by taking some online classes, by interviewing people from around the world. You may find them in hundreds of different places, and you get all these different learning experiences. Now, in a traditional school environment, in many places, you learn something in the same place where then they give you a credential for it. Maybe you earned an A in the class, or it went on your transcript when you finished it. Now we're actually seeing those things separated, unbundled. You may learn something in one place, but you go another place to get a credential to demonstrate that you've learned it. You get feedback and you experience mentors from many different places, not just one sort of set structured place where there's one person who controls the whole environment. You get practice and resources from all over the place. So in reality, what's happened is we've moved from this concept of a pre-served meal on the left to a buffet-style experience of education, where there are hundreds of options available to you, perhaps thousands, and you go through and you select exactly what you think that you need or want for your own learning experience. And this is the possibility that's emerged with our increasingly connected world, that we can actually sort of blend these different resources and experiences and feedback and credentials from many different places and pull them together for one sort of whole learning experience for a young person. So this is a really exciting development. We're seeing it impact traditional education. In fact, I don't know if it's going to be successful in the long term or not, but there was an example of the Black Mountain Soul, stands for Self-Organized Learning Environment, by a concept from Sugata Mitra and his hole-in-the-wall experiment in India. But anyway, they took this place in the Black Mountains and in the United States, and they found this old facility that used to be an alternative college, and they essentially created almost like a university experience, but it didn't have professors, courses, credits, or degrees. It was the environment, the community. They had coaches and mentors available, and I'm certainly not an expert on this particular one, the Black Mountain Soul, but it was clearly an example of unbundled education. Who would have thought in the past of having this space where you go to learn, but it doesn't have the traditional sort of trappings of a university experience. But it does have the community, and it has other resources. And so where do they get the professors? Well, they might go there and they take online classes from one of several universities, and they blend together their experience. That's one example of what we're seeing here, and we're going to see a lot more of that just because it's more possible now. So then the last slide I have for you, I want to make sure that we have plenty of time here for Q&A, is the awakening. And this isn't really a trend, but it's sort of the final concept that I think we're leading up to here. So, and I put this, these are my own words, so I'm quoting myself. More people are realizing that it's unnecessary and unwise to limit a learning organization or a learner's experience to what you get from a single curriculum provider, a single textbook, or a single workbook series, or a single school program. People have more choices than any time in history when it comes to finding the right learning fit for students. And students have that freedom themselves. And so if we go through these different things like maker spaces and project-based learning and blended learning and all the others that we've talked about, there's really this growing awakening that we have more control. We can be more self-directed and self-determined in our learning experiences. And one of the challenges and joys and opportunities in this age of learning is helping young people discover and embrace this, to have this awakening, to realize the freedom and the resources available to their learning, and to leverage these different kind of emerging developments to have the best high-impact learning experience they can have for now and moving into the future for the rest of their lives. Now, if this has caught your interest, I will mention that what I just shared with you is largely based upon an article that was just published in the last week in the Homeschool Handbook called 10 Trends That Are Transforming Homeschooling in the Digital Age. And if you just Google or you just go to the Homeschooling Handbook, you can click on the most current issue and click in, and I think you can download a free copy of the Homeschooling Handbook, and this article is available there. So let me just stop now and see what kind of questions or comments you have. I believe that it'll be possible to give you talking rights, the ability to speak, or to type your questions. And I'm just going to pause and see what kind of comments or questions we have.
If you have a question, you can put it in the chat just by typing in the chat window. Or feel free to grab the microphone, which you would do by clicking on the talk button at the top left of your screen. Bernard, I'm interested in the degree to which you see, so if Ivan Illich said that school was representative of all these institutions in society, and so there are these 10 trends in the schooling and homeschooling world. I'm interested in the degree to which you see this paralleling itself outside of school, and what the implications for learners are in a world in which there are changes taking place institutionally in many different areas.
Sure. So even in the so as we look at these trends, my broader research, I should mention too, is I spent the last couple of years especially fascinated with educational entrepreneurship and looking at startup businesses and looking at the ways that sort of trends are developing in these other kind of workplace environments. So I'm seeing, like for example, I mentioned the digital badging and the alternative credentialing. Let's play with that for a moment. We're seeing now in some work environments, there's a dissatisfaction with people who are graduating from traditional schools coming and not having the skill sets they really need them to have to be successful in a given work environment. And so what they're saying is, well, why do we have to depend upon these schools to be the provider of the learning experience? Why don't we provide them ourselves? Or why don't we explore alternate ways for them to learn this that are really more tied to, are they truly competent and competent with this skill set? And so I think we see, for example, Udacity has a new initiative that they've announced about that's connected with the company Salesforce, and these are micro diplomas. They're like 1-year diplomas that are tied to really specific skill sets for employment in a place like Salesforce. And the people at Salesforce and similar companies will be teaching the courses. And so this isn't necessarily outside of education, but it is. I mean, it's outside of formal schooling environments as we thought about them in the past. And then also, we certainly see some of the other trends like blended learning and just the way that people are living. We're living more blended lives in the way that we sort of leverage digital tools and face-to-face experiences to kind of shape our own individual family lives and our own individual lives in the ways that fit our own goals and aspirations. I don't know, is that, Steve, is that sort of addressing your question, or were you asking something different?
No, I think it does. So again, if you have a question, you're welcome to put it in the chat, or you can raise your hand. Bernard, do you feel like there's any kind of a disconnect between what companies say they want in employees and what they sort of institutionally, the structure they have for guiding people into the interview process? When people say that companies really want kind of the independent, proactive, self-directed worker, does that end up being the reality in terms of how employment actually gets handled?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And Steve, I think we talked about this a little bit when we were together last week or the week before, but one thing that I've been spending a little time on is this whole, the over-credentialization of society. And Illich, as you mentioned before, wrote about sort of over-professionalization in society and so forth. So it's really interesting to look at what are the entry-level requirements for employment in many places. And oftentimes, we're seeing a growing number of people who just sort of throw out on the requirements, must have a bachelor's degree in a certain field or a related field, or even just must have a bachelor's degree. And yet, if we look really closely at what skills are necessary to be successful or to thrive in that job, a bachelor's degree really isn't necessary. In fact, it might be easier to hire someone. The skills that you need to really thrive on the work are probably going to be learned in the workplace, not in some kind of formal schooling environment in the first place. So I think there's that piece to it. But then the other piece is, do people really want self-directed learners? And I think that's going to vary across organizations and companies. I spend a lot of my time working with entrepreneurship endeavors. And certainly the entrepreneurial spirit is one that really welcomes and embraces more self-direction oftentimes. As we look at other more traditional workplace environments, I'm sure that we're going to, that's part of probably why our schooling environment is still holding up, is that schools do a pretty good job of teaching people to follow rules and to be on time and to sort of be good, compliant workers. And it's not the curriculum that's being taught, it's just sort of the format and the structure of school. And I do see a number of work environments that still really kind of value that and are looking for that.
Great. Hey, we'd like to finish with a few minutes so people can take a quick break before the next session. We've got Blake Bowles coming up with a keynote. And Bernard, thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Really loved having you here again. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to turn the recording off, and we'll have you exit the room so that it can process.